Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. While bombs are exploding, millions of Iraqis will be voting in an historic election. The polls indicate the race will be very tight, yet pundits are predicting a landslide for former Prime Minister Alawi due to the poor performance of al-Maliki's government over the past 5 years. So it is no accident that warnings of massive election fraud have been issued by many politicians. More ominously, the Vice President al-Hashimi has warned that if al-Maliki loses the election, he just might engineer a military coup d'etat. So will the winner of this election succeed in ending the misery of Iraqis? Will he put an end to the stealing of the public treasury by corrupt politicians? Omar Saleh reporting from Ramadi.
They are hoping for a better life, a better government, and perhaps a better future. Millions of Iraqis are going to the polls to choose their representatives, some of whom may go on to become leaders of the country. But this election is different from previous ones. It's dubbed as the make or break election for Iraq as a state and for the country's social cohesion. The last 4 years have been testing times for Iraqis. Some see gains, others see losses, depending on who you talk to. But the vast majority of Iraqis agree that what is hoped for has not been achieved, mainly in security, social services and employment. Opinions differ, ranging from despair to abiding hope.
I won't vote because the government has done nothing for us. They only rebuilt the Shia areas and neglected the Sunni ones.
I will vote because we need change and we need to build Iraq's future.
Other Iraqis question the caliber and motives of the candidates running for elections.
I want the candidates to implement their promises as fast as they hang their posters. I really wish they would implement what they say.
We only see the candidates in election days and on posters.
Almost 7 years on since the US-led occupation, many Iraqis now have a clearer picture of the sort of leaders and politicians they want. Thousands of candidates and thousands promises. It's even sometimes hard for voters to keep track of who says what. But for these elections, many Iraqis seem to know what they want, and they want change for a better government and better living conditions.
To discuss the upcoming election and how it might impact the lives of millions of Iraqis, I am delighted to welcome from Washington, Michael Rubin, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And from Baghdad, Ismail Zayer, editor-in-chief of New Sabah newspaper. And from London, by Sami Ramadani, a professor of applied social sciences at the London Metropolitan University. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Ismail Zayer, we are just a few days away from the election. What do you predict? Is this going to be a landslide for Alawi, or are we going to have a status quo just like we have it now?
I don't think status quo will remain as before. I do believe that the opponents of Alawi gave him a very big present last month, the last 4 weeks. They committed a lot of mistakes, a lot of big mistakes, especially al-Maliki. Maliki lost his chances to have or to work or to cooperate with any big bloc. His drifted from the coalition, Islamic coalition, previous one, leading him to a sort of very isolated position. Nevertheless, he still have big support. But a lot of people foresee that his chances as much as bigger will be, as much as he will weaken the Shi'i group. And the discourse of al-Maliki last few weeks, especially towards anti-Baathism and de-Baathifications, polarize millions of votes on the other side, which is Alawi's side. I think they gave Alawi very nice present for gratis. And the whole predictions that Alawi will have a landslide, whatever al-Maliki will win will not be important, because the big 3 blocs, which is the Kurds and Alawi and al-Itilaf, will not let al-Maliki again to the power.
Committing massive mistakes has not been the sole province of al-Maliki, Michael Rubin. The Kurds, over the past 5 years, they have committed some mistakes, and that those mistakes will be reflected in this upcoming election. The bloc that was headed by Jalal Talbani and Masoud Barazani has been fractured. Lately, you have just came back from Iraq. What is your prediction? What is going to happen in the Kurdistan area?
Well, specifically in the Kurdistan area, but more broadly in Iraq, one of the most significant changes in this election is that they're going to be using an open list system so people can vote for individuals and therefore bypass those who have the biggest reputations for corruption. Now, corruption is a huge problem in Iraqi Kurdistan and, frankly, the rest of Iraq. But in Iraqi Kurdistan, it really has led to the fracturing of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, Jalal Talabani's political party. And so a lot of people are rightly asking, in Baghdad, for example, and in Najaf and Basra and so forth, why should Jalal Talabani remain as president of Iraq when he can't even manage his own political party? But the biggest mistake the Kurds may make may be still to come, and that is with the Americans withdrawing, the Kurds will use this election in order to try to negotiate as hard as possible for what they want with regard to federalism, Kirkuk, oil, and so forth. But they might negotiate too hard to the point where you might see the formation of an anti-Kurdish bloc among many of the other opponents in the coalition negotiations which will follow this election.
In fact, you don't have to wait until the end of the election. That bloc has been formed, and those sentiments have been growing over the past 4 or 5 years because of Kirkuk. But let me see if I can make it 3-4-3. Sami Ramadani, both Ismail Zayer and Michael Rubin, they're talking about change. Do you predict it? Do you see it?
I'm afraid the odd man out here in a sense, because I see this election as yet another game of musical chairs, because these are the same politicians, they might come slightly under different headings, but we are essentially talking about the same group of people who came with the United States, supported the invasion of Iraq, held power with the permission of Paul Bremer, and so on and so forth. And the previous elections have shown really that fundamentally there hasn't been much change, and the same will happen again. Iraq, in fact, is sinking deeper into the mire, with the livelihood of the people, their daily lives deteriorating sharply across the country, from the deepest south to the regions of Iraqi Kurdistan. And these politicians, no matter what they promise today, one thing they are all agreed not to talk about, that they all live in the green zone, guarded by US tanks. Nobody dares talk about the presence of about 100,000 US soldiers. It is taken, I mean, even Michael just now used the phrase that when the United States leaves. I don't see it that way. Only a few days ago, General Odeno said that the United States might stay much longer than envisaged, depending on the situation in the country. There are deep-seated problems that these corrupt politicians are unable to resolve, and unfortunately, most of them listen first to Washington, then to the Iraqi people.
Ismail Zayer, the picture as portrayed by Sami Ramadani is very bleak and disheartening, and yet there is a glimmer of hope in all this, and that is the change that happened to the Iraqi body politics. The Iraqis are now, in 2010, they are not the same Iraqis in 2004 and 2005, because we saw perhaps an indication of that with the provincial elections. The liberals, the seculars, and the nationalists, they made a tremendous showing. Will that be repeated in this upcoming election, Ismail?
I think this showing will continue, but for different reasons. Different reasons from a different point of view. For example, the Sunnis fear now what will be the outcome if the Shi'i party will come again and they will maintain the power. They will face a lot of threats, especially the reactivating of this debathification policies. They even punish the ministers, Minister of Defense, Minister of that and that, the leaders of the army who had been then accepted and agreed to be part of the teams of the rebuilding the Iraqi army last 4 or 5 years. This is in one hand. On the other, the services, the deterioration of the service in the country make a lot of people decide or conclude that they have to say something. They have to punish somebody. The other thing also that the American had their interest to get rid of this kind of, what do you call it, thing over their shoulders. That's why they prefer to have a sort of, what do you call it, wider political alliances rather than keeping the safety net as before. That's why I do believe and I foresee that the change is coming for different reasons, and the mistakes the government committed and the others committed will be obviously reflected in the next election.
There are a couple of warnings, Michael Rubin. The Grand Ayatollah al-Najafi warned against perhaps massive fraud. Tariq al-Hashimi predicted that something like that might happen. Ayad Alawi warned that if there is a massive fraud, his party and his bloc, they might just sit out the entire political process. Do you envisage a massive fraud?
I'm worried about it. When I was down in Najaf, when I was in Baghdad, it's all I heard about. But there's a couple important points here. First of all, no matter whether there is fraud or not, whoever loses in this election is going to claim that there is fraud. After the last elections, after the municipal elections, there is a great deal less respect for the Independent High Election Commission of Iraq, which was accused of being bought by, in Iraqi Kurdistan, Masoud Barzani's political party, so that there was even a hearing in parliament with regard to this. What I heard specifically is that some politicians might be planning, especially among the two mostly Shia parties, to purposely spoil ballot boxes in areas where they're losing in order to throw out the majority of votes for the other party. So I think we're going to have a bit of a mess after Election Day is over, trying to sort this all out. It's one reason why I think we're going to be in a process for weeks, if not months.
I'll take a brief comment from Sami. Go ahead, Sami.
Yes, sure. I think fraud is somehow inbuilt within the system because of the level of corruption within the state. Then obviously corrupt politicians who oversee this entire process are not going to be immune to fraudulent activity. This is how I see it. This was the practice in past elections as well. I mean, there are parties now going around the streets paying people cash and making them swear on the Quran that they will vote for this or that list. The separation of voting between the military servicemen, the police, and so on. Quite a substantial bit of voting. They'll vote in their workplaces. There could be pressure on those to vote in certain ways. I have it on reliable sources that in the last election, in fact, the votes declared in Kurdistan were agreed upon between Talbani and Barzani. They were not really the votes counted even in the ballot boxes. Some were obviously stuffed full, over 100% of the electorate voting in some polling stations, and so on and so forth. And I recently heard that some 26 million ballot papers have been printed. There are 19 million electorates. So what's that all about? Why print 7 million more ballot papers than necessary?
Go ahead, Michael.
But
if I could
go ahead.
Just if I could respond to one or two points there, I do think it's important to note that in last year's local elections, the municipal elections, especially in the South, you did have an anti-incumbent sentiment which throughout most of the politicians from the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, to the point where they even had difficulty in the subsequent coalition negotiations in most of the provinces in which they were. So this does show that there is some sort of culture of accountability which is at least getting its start. And in Iraqi Kurdistan, it's all well and good to say it was all preordained, and certainly in Duhok it was, and there's unresolved questions about what happened in the last hours of the voting. But on the other hand, if it was all preordained, you wouldn't have seen the emergence of Noshirwan Mustafa's Quran list.
Let me just pick up on the last point, Ismail Zair, what Michael Rubin said about the anti-incumbent. We saw in the provincial election, Mr. Haboubi, who in Najaf, in the Karbala district, he won more than anybody else, and yet when the time came for him to take his seats and take his people into the provincial councils, basically they ostracized him, basically they kicked him out. So why should we have the faith and the hope that people who will make a good showing, even if it is not a total majority, will be given the chance to rule.
We don't have to give anything now. We know the politicians, we know the political parties, and we know the blocs, the competition type or the nature. But what happened, there's a few things have been taking place on the ground, which is positive in that regard. First of all, everybody is warning from fraud. That's why everybody have interest not to make it happen. First. Second, there is a changing in the way of counting the votes. In the past, they have a center, and they have a lot of, let's say, voting places, and the count of the votes in the past, in the last elections, taking place in the big center. That's why the journey from the small center to the big center was the journey where they change and they shift and they make all what they like in the voting count. This time, the system has been changed. The counting will take place on the spot, and this will be also regarded and put on the screens. That's why we can see that
well, let's hope you are right, Ismail Zair, because last time in the last election, and that's according to the Iraqi police and the military, you know, trucks full of boxes stuffed with ballot papers came all the way from Iran, and the Iraqi government confiscated it. So there is no reason not to believe that the same thing will be repeated, Sami Ramadani, especially that the Grand Ayatollah Najafi has warned that there are some pencils or pen have been imported into Iraq in order to remove the ink on which Iraqis are going to vote on these ballot papers.
On the removal of ink, Jassim, this happened in the previous election. And by the way, Michael, when I referred to the last election, I was referring to the 2005 general election and not the local elections. And certainly that was fixed. And this was told to me by a member of the election commission itself. And I have the figures for that.
No, I know.
But I was referring to the 2005 elections and not the local elections. But on the question of fraud, these politicians are actively fraudulent today in terms of the misuse of public funds. If they are misusing public funds, if they are cutting off even that meager food ration, I mean, you go to the streets in the south, in many parts of Iraq, people are not even getting the meager food rations properly every month. You're talking about quite ruthless politicians, and I don't put it past them that they will be quarreling amongst themselves in terms of
Let me ask Ismail Zair and roll two questions in one, Ismail Zair. First, will the new government, whether let's just suppose it's going to be headed by Ayad Allawi, will make a difference, and will those corrupt politicians who've pilfered billions of dollars for the past 4 years, there were $400 billion spent in Iraq, will they be punished? Will they be brought to justice?
Well, first, I think any government, any cabinet, whoever the prime minister will be, they will have a sort of balance of power. That's the reason why we say that the fraud will be different this time. It's not that they don't like to make a fraud, but they cannot do it in the same old way. There is now a balance of power. The Shi'i fraction divided, and everyone watching the other one, Maliki and Tilaf in one hand, and you have now a third party, which is Bolani. The Kurds, as we mentioned, as Michael mentioned before, and you mentioned also that the Nichirwan change bloc came out, and they take something like 25% of the votes. It's weakened the big traditional blocs. That's why we have different balance of power. That will make those parties much more flexible to bargain or to
but
trade.
I'm not sure to what degree they will be able to push the country forward, Michael Rubin, because the bacillus.
That's right.
The bacillus of this
corruption.
Illness. Hold on just a second, Ismail.
Mr. Jassim, I would like to say something.
Make it quick.
The corruption is not necessarily now in the country. For example, the financial campaigning or campaign financial staff is bigger than what we expect. A lot of money had been spent. This because the last 5 years, a lot of Iraqis managed to put their hands on a lot of resources, not necessarily from the corruption part of the bargaining with the United States, from within the country. We have billionaires now, we have hundreds of millionaires. That's the difference.
That is one problem, but the other bigger problem, and let me just go to Michael Rubin, and that is the bacillus of this illness was embedded in the Iraqi constitution, where the sectarian quota and all the other problems, including Article 140, which in an essence is going to paralyze the entire country for perhaps years and years to come, where the Kurds, as you said in the beginning, they bargained very hard. They got exactly what they wanted. They have them in ironclad clauses in the constitution, and now nobody can change it.
Well, I want to quibble with you a little bit. First of all, they will be negotiating even harder now on the issues which they've kicked down the road, like Kirkuk, because they do fear, even if not everyone agrees, that the United States is going to withdraw. I happen to think the United States is going to withdraw as well. However, I would argue that one of the biggest changes here, which you didn't mention, was that switch from having, if we compare to 2005, a nationwide ballot with a closed list system versus a more local ballot with an open list system, much more transparent. The old system, the closed single constituency system, that really empowered the demagogues, the ethnic demagogues and the sectarian demagogues, because they controlled the fate of the people on their lists. Politicians were accountable to these party bosses, in the case of the Kurds, these warlords, rather than being accountable to local constituencies. I do think we're going to see a significant change and a real desire for change among Iraqis in Basra, Najaf, and all the way up to Kurdistan, because as we've heard, corruption has become such a problem, people are becoming sick and tired of it.
Thank you,
I think, for one, that it's if I could just one last sentence, it's really refreshing among Arab states to see not knowing the result of an election.
I have 1 minute left to me. I'll take two quick responses from Ismail Zair, and then I finish with Sami Ramadani. What are the chances, Ismail, of a military coup d'etat by al-Maliki, taking into consideration the Americans are still here in Iraq?
It is none. It will be a suicide. No one can do that. Nevertheless, nobody with complete wisdom will exclude that. I think this is something you have to put in your mind, but it will be a big problem.
Wrap up the show for me, Sami Ramadani. Go ahead.
I think both Ismail and Michael are really whistling in the dark. I really can't see the logic of it. Michael says that these are very corrupt politicians and our people are sick of them. But these are the same politicians leading all the lists and all the process. And as you said, Jassim, this constitution itself, that this entire edifice is built on, is a series of landmines. You explode one and another is on the way and another is on the way. The entire system is premised in an occupied country, and really the road forward looks extremely bleak as long as this general climate continues.
Sami Ramadani, Ismail Zair, Michael Rubin. Gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To watch the show online, please visit our website, aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until I see you again, this is Jassim Azzawi wishing you a great week.